Good morning, West Main Church of Christ. I trust everyone is staying safe and staying healthy. This morning we're going to turn back to the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 3 and examine the story of Cain and Abel. And I think this is a particularly appropriate theme at this time because of the fact that, our world has been upended. Everything's been changed. And the things that once were, we don't know what society and everything will look like exactly when we come out of this pandemic. And so it's really, really a good time for self-reflection. And I think one of the things that I hope that people will reflect on during this time with family and this time away from all of the running and crazy schedules of life is that we'll reflect on whose will really should matter in our lives. In 1968, Frank Sinatra put out a song called My Way. And you'll remember that the whole anthem is all about a person's personal success and the things that he achieved on his own without the aid of anybody else. And it's basically saying to the world, hey, listen, I did it my way. I did everything I wanted to do and nobody told me what to do, and I bent the knee to nobody. In fact, the close of that song, as Sinatra croons away, he says, and now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear, I'll state my case of which I'm certain. I lived a life that's full. I traveled each and every highway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. You see, I think that Sinatra's song wasn't just an anthem for him personally. I think it was an anthem for our culture. Americans, for the longest time, we have been the bootstrap people who say, I can do it on my own, that I'm going to make my own choices. And we're quick to defend our rights and how we should be treated by other people and to stand up for ourselves. And in some measure, all of that is good. Except the problem is that it can usher in a sense of pride when we say, I did it my way. That I have accomplished all these things on my own. I did it without help. I did it without assistance. When we do that, there's a fine line that we cross over to where we're not just saying it to others, because it's not even true. Everybody who does anything of any accomplishment in this life owes success to so many others who help them along the way. But when it's particularly dangerous is when we cross over the line, and whether we verbalize it or not, or whether we even consciously recognize it or not, when we really believe we've accomplished and done things our own way in our lives without the aid of God. You see, during this strange time, we all are trying to rely on the Lord. At least I hope we all are. And we're starting to realize we don't have any solution to this. Our doctors don't even know how to fix it. They give us different timelines every single day, different guesses as to when it's going to be over and how many people are going to be affected and how many casualties there'll be and all of this. And it changes all the time because people don't really know. It's not something we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And so I hope that in this time, people in general, but especially the people of God, will reflect on what it means to do things God's way and to rely upon Him in humility and in faith. In Genesis chapter 4, we see perhaps the first telling of this anthem of human foolishness in the story of Cain and Abel. And the background, of course, is that the Garden of Eden is gone. Adam and Eve have squandered that in their sin. And now Adam is having to work the toil by the sweat of his brow, and Eve has been subjected to childbearing. And now they no longer have access to the tree of life. And so year by year, they are beginning to deteriorate and face their own mortality. But God has made them a promise. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, when talking to Eve and Adam and the devil after their fall, it says, "And I will put enmity between you," speaking to the devil, "and to the woman, and between your seed and her seed, for he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." This has long been recognized as a messianic prophecy of how Jesus would eventually win the victory over sin and death and over Satan. But Adam and Eve surely understood this to be a promise to them, for their son, their seed, would have the victory over Satan. And so they were clearly looking for that promised one, for that seed. And I wonder if they at first thought it might be Cain, their firstborn. Of course, they had Cain and Abel. They raised both of those boys. Cain tilled the earth. Abel tended the flocks. And you'll remember the story that both Cain and Abel, they brought a sacrifice unto the Lord. But that sacrifice, it was not sufficient in regard to Cain's, which was a sacrifice of what he had grown from the earth. But God was pleased with the lamb that was sacrificed by Abel. We look back in Genesis chapter 4, and the story is told in verses 1 through 16. "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and he conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Then she bore him again, and this time his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground to the Lord. And Abel also brought the firstlings of his flock and their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him. Now you remember right after this is that very well-known line where God says, Where is your brother Abel? And he says, Am I my brother's keeper? And in all of this, we see that Cain was jealous because he wanted the favor of God, but he wanted to be able to do it his own way. We call this sometimes, you want your cake and eat it too. Cain wanted to please God. He wanted God to respect him like he did Abel. He wanted God to accept his sacrifice, but yet he wanted to be able to do it on his own terms, to be able to dictate what he wanted and have that be good enough for God. But the problem was is that God does not respect pride and arrogance. God has always honored, respected, and blessed those who humbly serve him. Those who, rather than saying, my way, say, God, I want to do things your way. Now, one particular area that this is really accented is in the area of worship. The time comes for them to worship God. And that's what this story really is all about, the kind of worship they offer unto God. And in this story, Cain brings his crop, Abel brings his best lamb, but God is only pleased by one. Have you ever wondered why? I mean, if Cain is a farmer and that's what he has, then he brings his very best crops, I don't know what he raised, tomatoes or potatoes or whatever it was. But if he brings the best of them and Abel brings the best of what he has, why is God accepting of one and rejecting of the other? Well, I hope to answer that as we look in all of Scripture and see some principles that provide us with three reasons why Abel's sacrifice was better than Cain's, and why Abel's was accepted and Cain's was not. And in essence, it all wraps around to one did it God's way and the other did it my way. You see, there were two different levels of commitment. In one, he simply digs up that vegetable from the ground, cleans it off, takes it to God. But Abel's sacrifice involved more than just something being offered or given. It involved sacrifice. It involved the life of that lamb. Cain's offered a portion of his earnings, but Abel sacrificed a life. It is a quantitative difference and a qualitative difference, because life is more than just a portion. And of course, the importance of living, breathing, living is more important than simply that which is grown from the ground. It's kind of like the old joke of the pig and the chicken, where, they both are reflecting on how important they are to the farm and to the operation. And the chicken says, the farmer values me because I provide eggs every single morning. And the pig says, yeah, but I'm more important because what you do, it requires a little effort. But when I produce bacon, it requires total sacrifice. And that kind of reflects the difference in this. One was just a little effort. The other reflects total sacrifice. You see, one just put forth a little bit. The other put forth everything. And it makes us ask the question, does easy, cheap, or convenient please God? Most certainly not. God has always asked of us our everything. Jesus would say it this way, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. Paul, when talking about what he had given for Christ, he says, I have been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth within me. Those are both expressions of total sacrifice. Remember, we talked about a while back that Jesus would mention, if you don't love me more than father and mother and son and daughter. And the principle there is not that we shouldn't love others. It's that he desires to be our everything. He desires to be first. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, David illustrates this well, where it says, then the king said to Araunah, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price. Nor will I offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. So see, he's offered something for free, and David says, there is no way. I'm not going to give God something that didn't cost me something, that didn't have a sacrifice involved. And so when we look back at the story of Cain and Abel, it illustrates for us the importance of sacrifice. So the first reason that Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's was not is they illustrated two different levels of commitment. They also illustrated two different levels of reverence. The entire scheme of redemption is dependent upon the sacrifice of a lamb. You'll remember that in the Passover, that as God was going to send death upon the firstborn of Egypt, he instructed the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and to smear the blood over the doorposts and the top of their doors. And so death would pass over them. And it was significant of the importance of that sacrifice. And we know that's just a shadow of the true Lamb of God in Jesus Christ. And that blood that when it covers our life, that sin passes over, death passes over us. You see, that scheme of redemption that we've all relied upon and through which we've all been saved is absolutely dependent upon the sacrifice of a lamb. So we ask the question, doesn't then a bloodless sacrifice cheapen the cost of sin? You see, sin and shortcoming, the fall of man, that Cain and Abel were intimately connected to. I mean, their mother and father are the ones that issued sin into the world. And when we think about the cost of sin, to just say, well, I'll just give the Lord a portion of that which cost me a little bit of effort to dig it out of the ground, to wash it off, versus what it meant to Abel to have to take the life of that lamb, to offer it to God. It was illustrative of how serious man's fall really was. Perhaps Cain was the very first to try a shortcut, to say, that's too much to give. That's too much to offer. And aren't we grateful that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, when Jesus Christ came to this earth, he didn't try to find a shortcut. And even when he was facing the cross, just right around the corner in his life in the Garden of Gethsemane, he cries out, Lord, if there be any way, 3 times, let this cup pass from me. But then he says, but thy will be done. And then that he says, Lord, whatever you ask me, no matter the cost, I will pay the price. You see, Cain and Abel offered 2 different levels of reverence. And thirdly, the difference between their sacrifices is they illustrated 2 different characters, 2 different senses of integrity. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4, Hebrews 11 verse 4 in the Hall of Faith, it says, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks. You see, that speaks of the fact that Abel, his character was excellent in his offering. God rejected Cain's gift because God rejected Cain's character. Cain was simply looking for the bare minimum of what he had to offer, rather than going the extra mile, putting his whole heart into it, seeking what God would want, God's way, over what he wanted, his way. Abel's heart was right. Cain's was not. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 12, John writes and says, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. In Deuteronomy 8, we read this recently in one of our studies. In Deuteronomy 8, verses 1 and 2, he talks about why God allowed them to wander in the wilderness as the Israelites. And we know it's a shadow of why we're allowed to wander in the wilderness of this life before we go to the ultimate promised land. And he says this, so I could test you and know what is in your heart, whether you keep my commandments or not. How is it that God knows our heart? By how we keep his commandments, by our obedience. You see, obedience is a form of communication to God. It says to God what matters in our heart. And Abel, he went the extra mile. He gave God precisely what God desired. Cain, his sacrifice reflected what was in his heart, which was to do it his way. You see, they had 2 different characters. They had 2 different desires. One was putting God first. The other was putting God second and putting himself first. In Proverbs 14:12, it says, there is a way that seemeth right unto man, but in the end it leads to death. I wish somebody could have communicated that to Frank Sinatra. and to Cain and to so many countless others who've said, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to do what I do. Even I'm going to worship God my way. You see, it must be offered His way. With the right sacrifice, we need to rest assured that just as it told us in Hebrews chapter 11, that Cain, even though dead, he still speaks through that awesome, sincere sacrifice, that his obedience reflected his heart. So for us, if we offer the right kind of life, the right kind of worship, the right kind of sacrifice to God, there's a confidence found therein. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and following, the Hebrew writer says, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to judge all the earth, the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkled that speaks better things than that of Abel." You see, he's saying if we sacrifice and live by faith as they did in Hebrews chapter 11, as it tells us through the entire chapter, and as Abel is one of the very first examples, he says we too offer that same kind of sacrifice when we live by that same kind of faith. When we live our lives, not by saying, I want to do it my way, but live our lives according to His way. I hope you're all staying healthy, staying safe, and we so look forward, and the day will come when we're all back together. But until that time, we love you, and if you have any needs, please reach out to the elders of the West Main Church, to myself, to Nathan, to any of the staff or the deacons. We want to be there for you. We want to be there for each other. We love you.